Have y'all ever heard of a man named Adoniram Judson? I know that's a very popular name among baby names today. Adoniram. I don't even know what you shorten that to. But Adoniram Judson was a man who was born back in 1788. He was born into a preacher's family and raised that way. Taught scripture, taught faith, but he was also incredibly brilliant. To the tune, he graduated high school when he was 16 and was going to college when he was 16. His father, the preacher, convinced him to go to this Christian college. Well, the Christian college wasn't made up entirely of Christians because he very quickly, Adoniram, very quickly fell in with this group that was kind of spearheaded or led by another young man named Jacob Eames, who was a devout atheist and mocked all things Christian. And so Adoniram Judson, falling in with this Christian mocker, kind of tore his faith to pieces. And as he quickly realized, he never actually believed in Jesus growing up. And he began to fall in line with all those people he was hanging around with. And he himself began to mock Jesus and all things Christian. And he kind of pushed his parents away because they kept trying to bring him back to faith, bring him back to not falling in with some of the habits that went along with some of his friends that he was hanging around with. Well, when Adoniram graduated from college, he started him a little private school in his early 20s. He wrote several textbooks because he, again, was incredibly brilliant. And but his parents, he was still in the city, the area where his parents were. His parents still tried to have influence over him, still tried to express love to him, but everything about his parents screamed Christian, and so he didn't want anything to do with them. So he ended up just giving up on all of his, the school he had started, all his aspirations there in town because his parents were there, and he just left and wanted to tour the country, tour the world. So he hopped on a train, and as he was going out, he had to stop one night and spend the night at this one city. He was in his mid to late 20s at this point, and he got a room at a bed and breakfast there in town. Well, the clerk at the bed and breakfast, when he walked in, tried to convince him not to take a room there. They said they only had one room left, but it was right next to a man who was deathly ill. The doctors had actually just left, saying the man's not going to make the night. So we do have one room, but it's right next to that man. He's in a lot of pain. I don't really know if you want that room. And Adoniram told the clerk, well, I've got to have a room. You're the only place in town. Just let me take it. I'll just do my best and try to sleep. And so he goes up there and he gets in the room. Well, come to find out, the clerk knew what he was talking about because the man in the next room just groaned in pain, screamed in pain all night long. In addition to that, the innkeeper and the doctor were coming and going all night long up and down the hallway. So Adoniram couldn't get to sleep. He laid awake all night long. And as tends to happen late at night, your mind wanders into all kinds of areas. And being next door to a man who was dying and hearing his groans of pain all night, Adoniram's thoughts all night long were all about death and eternity. Well, he got up the next morning and left his room, went down to the clerk at the bed and breakfast, the inn, and asked about the man. Said, there's no more noise. What happened? And the clerk said, well, the man died. Said, oh, what was the man's name? And the clerk said, well, it was a guy he was a professor at a college nearby. His name was Jacob Eames, which was Adoniram's friend from college, the atheist who took him down the wrong path. Adoniram was shocked. He was floored. He had to back up and sit down on a bench there in the lobby and just try to take it all in the moment. And all those thoughts about death and eternity he'd been thinking about all night just overwhelmed him. And he lost all of his pride in the moment because what grew within him was this great fear. His friend, the atheist, had just died, groaning in pain in the room next to him. So he did the only thing you can do in that moment. He went home, knocked on his parents' door. They welcomed him in. And sitting under their influence now, again, he began to return to faith. He wasn't a believer yet, But his father convinced him to go back to school. And Adoniram actually was able to enroll in seminary. He had to get a special permittance to allow him to enroll in seminary as an unbeliever, but because of who his father was, they let him in. And being around all of those Christians all the time, hearing about God's grace and God's movement, had an impact on young Adoniram, and he got saved. Graduated in a phenomenal way. And in the course of time, he began to pursue God and ask God, praying consistently what God had for him in the days to come. Well, God began to lay something on young Adoniram's heart, because at that time in American history, there were 0 international American missionaries. There were none. There were some missionaries who had gone to other parts of North America, but none overseas. And this just began to bother Adoniram. And actually, God, in the process of this, began to put one specific country on his mind and heart. It was the country of Burma. And he just could not get it out of his head. It was like God had stamped it in the valves of his heart. Every waking moment was about Burma. And so God, in the moment, having saved him now, was calling him to be an international missionary to Burma when there were 0 international missionaries from America. And so he had this calling from God. Well, he graduated seminary, and he gets a phone call from one of his father's pastor friends in nearby Boston. He was a pastor of a very large church in Boston. The church actually still stands today. It's still there. They still function. People are still there. It's not quite as well attended as it was back then, but he gets a call from this pastor saying, I want you to come, new seminary graduate, and be an associate pastor here at our church. We need help. Well, he gets off the phone, tells his family. His family's ecstatic because he could still live at home. If he wanted his own place, he could build a place there on their land, and he could still be with his family, and he could go and serve the Lord at this church. They thought it was the perfect scenario. But he said, no, I actually told him no, because my calling from God is to go and be a missionary overseas in Burma. You see, for Adoniram, he had to choose whether he would take the comfortable, easy road or he would listen to the Lord. He had to choose if he was going to go be what his family wanted him to be, or he was going to be what the Lord wanted him to be. And for him, there was really no question. He immediately rejected that offer, and he went and did what God wanted him to do, ultimately bringing the gospel to Burma. And like I said, that church still stands in Boston, but his ministry to Burma brought over 50,000 people to Christ. 50,000, because he listened to the Lord, taking the gospel there. You see, who we are is revealed through our actions and what we do. And that's what we're going to take a look at today. Mark chapter 14 is where we're going to be. Mark chapter 14. We're going through a series examining the last 12 to 15 hours before Jesus was crucified. We saw Jesus, after he left being in the upper room, praying. John chapter 17, praying for his disciples, praying for those who would believe from his disciples' ministry. They left there, went to the Garden of Gethsemane. Jesus was arrested, betrayed by Judas, arrested, and taken from there to what would end up being a series of interrogations and trials. So Mark chapter 14, we're going to start down in verse 53. It's on page 851 if you're going to use a pew Bible there. But as we get into this, I just want to preface this situation. You see, he's going to be taken before the Sanhedrin, which was the Jewish court. He was going to be taken before the Jewish court and tried for a capital case. They're going to try to execute him. But I want to give you some of their own rules as we get into this, just to lay the groundwork. For the Sanhedrin, for the Jewish court, capital cases were supposed to be tried and the verdict reached only during the daytime. Trials were not supposed to be conducted on the Sabbath or on a festival or the day before the Sabbath or the festival. This was early Friday morning of Passover, both the day before Sabbath and the day of a festival. Capital cases had to begin with reasons for acquittal, not for reasons for conviction. Nobody ever brings up, in Jesus' case, reasons for acquittal. Verdicts of acquittal could be reached on the same day, but convictions could only be reached after a good night's sleep on the following day. Condemnation required two agreeing witnesses. Disagreement between witnesses voided both their testimonies. In addition, if there was a false witness, the false witness was given the punishment that the accused was being tried for. Imagine if that were the case today. If you lied on the stand and you received the punishment that the accused was going to receive, I think that might cut down on a lot of the lying. But that was the case then. And the Sanhedrin, the Jewish ruling court, they were supposed to meet in the inner courts of the temple so anybody could come and watch. None of those things I just read are things they do. It's the middle of the night. This is in the high priest's house, not a public place. They got false witnesses all over the place. Witnesses disagreeing with each other all over the place. None of them receive the punishment that they're trying to get to Jesus. It all happens within just a matter of moments rather than a couple of days. But they don't care about the rules because they want what they want. So Jesus is brought in. Look at verse 53 of Mark chapter 14. And they led Jesus to the high priest. And all the chief priests and the elders and scribes came together. And Peter had followed him at a distance, right into the courtyard of the high priest. And he was sitting with the guards and warming himself at the fire. Very interesting scenario, right? Jesus had been arrested in the garden, and it said that all of the disciples fled from Jesus. They all ran away, scared. Well, we learn both here in Mark and in the book of John, Peter and John double back and begin to follow Jesus at a distance. They don't want to be associated. They don't want to be arrested too. But they get close to where Jesus is. And the chief priest's house is huge. I mean, it's like a mansion. And there's people everywhere. Probably some of the mob from the garden are there in the courtyard. The chief priest's servants are there in the courtyard. So it's a huge crowd there in the courtyard. Peter comes in. Maybe he puts a hood on his cloak. He puts it up so nobody really tries to keep from being recognized. And he goes in and he sits with the chief priest's guards of all people. Right? I mean, the enemy. Some of them were probably some of the guys who arrested Jesus. And he's sitting with those people around this fire in the middle of the night. So that's the scene outside. Back inside, verse 55. Now the chief priests and the whole council were seeking testimony against Jesus to put him to death, but they found none. For many bore false witness against him, but their testimony did not agree. And some stood up and bore false witness against him, saying, we heard him say, I will destroy this temple that is made with hands, and in 3 days I will build another not made with hands. And they took that as a terroristic threat, destroying the temple, building a new temple. But even when Jesus said this, he said it just to his disciples. Maybe it was overheard by somebody. Maybe Judas was the one who reported this. He was just saying it to them, but they, in parentheses, when he says it, is, but he was talking about the temple of his body. They gathered it was about his body and not the physical temple. Maybe it was hindsight that led them to that conclusion. But people, they were misunderstanding what Jesus said and using it out of context for their own nefarious purposes. You ever had somebody takes what you said out of context on purpose? Well, that's what's going on. They're taking Jesus' words and twisting them to mean whatever they want, to get whatever they want. And Jesus is sitting in the room, or not sitting, standing in the room when all this is going on. Now, if you're in the room and people are saying all kinds of lies about you, what's your response going to be typically? You going to be shouting them down? You're going to be going point by point of how they're wrong? About how they don't have any credibility in what they're saying? But that's not the case with Jesus. Verse 59, yet even about this, their testimony did not agree. And the chief priest stood up in the midst and asked Jesus, have you no answer to make? What is it these men testify against you? But he remained silent and made no answer. Again, the high priest asked him, are you the Christ, the Son of the blessed. So Jesus didn't feel the need to answer every lie and correct every misinterpretation. He just let them say what they're going to say. You know, it's often said we're the most like Jesus when we keep our mouth shut. Because a lot of times, I actually read that this morning in my Bible reading. It was let me pull that up for you. It's from the book of Proverbs. Nope. Too much talk leads to sin. Be sensible and keep your mouth shut. Too much talk leads to sin. Be sensible and keep your mouth shut. That's the words of Solomon in the book of Proverbs. Well, here Jesus doesn't say anything. He lets them say their lies. He lets them misinterpret what he's saying. And he just stands there in the room. And they're saying all of this. And the chief priests realize none of this is going to work because all these witnesses are disagreeing with each other. And it's obvious these guys are false witnesses in what they're saying. And so he tries to draw Jesus out. And he finally says, "Are you the Christ? Are you the Son of the Blessed, Son of God? Are you him?" Jesus is going to speak to this one. Because even though Jesus hasn't spoken to the false accusations that are being lobbed at him, he does speak to this one because this question is essential for the gospel. He's going to answer something that's essential for the gospel. If he is going to die for the sins of the world, he has to be God. Otherwise, his death doesn't have enough power to pay for everyone's sins. And so when the chief priest asks him, "Are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed?" he's going to answer this one because this is foundational to the reason he came. So Jesus says to him in verse 62, "I am. And you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming with the clouds of heaven." So he does two things. First, he answers the question. Yes, I am the Christ. Yes, I am the Son of God. But he says it in such a way with that phrase, "I am." That is the name of God from the Old Testament. He's not just saying, "I am the Son of God, I am the Christ, I am the Messiah." He's saying, "I am God. And you will see the Son of Man," me. That's a title for the Messiah from the Old Testament. "Seated at the right hand of power," right next to God, because I am him, coming with the clouds of heaven. So, again, if this is you, and you're in a room of people who hate your guts, mad at you, trying to find a reason to kill you, what do you think the reaction in the room is going to be to these words from Jesus? They said, "Are you the Christ? Are you the Messiah?" And he says, "I am God." I think everybody was like, okay, big deal. Or do you think there was a gasp and an outcry and an outroar and people looking for things to throw at him, kind of a situation? The chief priest responds to this. Verse 63, "And the high priest tore his garments and said, 'What further witnesses do we need?'" Now remember, they couldn't use any of those witnesses because they all disagreed with each other. They had to get Jesus to say something against himself, at least in their opinion. But Jesus wasn't saying something against himself. He was saying who he was. He was telling them who he was. There's no doubt about who he was, and he wasn't going to shy away from it. "What further witnesses do we need? You have heard his blasphemy." It's only blasphemy if he's wrong, which he's not. So the high priest asked the room, "What is your decision?" And they all condemned him as deserving death. So everyone there in the room voted against Jesus. Which is very interesting because we do know from other scriptures there were at least two guys on the Sanhedrin, the Jewish court, who were followers of Jesus. Nicodemus and Joseph of Arimathea. We see in the book of John, after Jesus died on the cross, they went and took his body very carefully, very lovingly, very delicately down from the cross and took his body, buried it in a tomb, put all kinds of spices and perfumes all over the place, and they took very good care of him. It doesn't make any sense if Nicodemus and Joseph are in the room voting against Jesus, and just a few hours later they're revealing to the world they're followers of Jesus by how they care for him. It's more likely a scenario they weren't there, that they weren't invited, probably because of how they would vote. They wouldn't have been asked to come to this situation. They may not have voted against Jesus. They may have even raised concerns like, guys, I think this trial is kind of against the rules. Like, we need to do this in order if we're going to do this at all, kind of a situation. So they weren't asked to come, so they wouldn't have been there. If everyone in the room condemned him as deserving death, we can say at least those two guys weren't there. Not only that, look at verse 65. They condemn him to death, and some began to spit on him and cover his face and strike him, saying, "Prophesy!" And the guards received him with blows. Which is also very interesting because of a prophecy back in Mark chapter 10. They're demanding that Jesus prophesy and mocking him. Jesus prophesies about this situation, that they're going to do this very thing. So by demanding Jesus to prophesy, those guards are fulfilling prophecy. And so this is all that's going on in the room with the Jewish court. Well, simultaneously, meanwhile, out in the courtyard, Peter's experiencing something as well. Look at verse 66. And as Peter was below in the courtyard, one of his servant girls of the high priest came, and seeing Peter warming himself, she looked at him and said, "You are also with the Nazarene, Jesus." Peter would have been trying to disguise himself, trying to hide himself, trying not to be noticed. But a servant of the high priest comes out there and says, "I know your face. You're one of those guys. You're one of them, one of the followers of Jesus," which would have been, again, a very tense moment because he's in the belly of the beast. I mean, he's on enemy territory here, and he's being recognized as a follower of Jesus who's just been arrested, is being condemned to death upstairs. And Peter hears this from the girl. Verse 68, but he denied it, saying, "I neither know nor understand what you mean." And he went out to the gateway, and the rooster crowed. Now that's also a very interesting sentence. I neither know nor understand what you mean, because that's actually a first century legal statement that he's making there. He's saying there is in no capacity that I know who you're talking about. I don't understand it. It doesn't make any sense to me. Me know Jesus the Nazarene. That doesn't work. And the rooster crows. Look at the next verse. Verse 69. And the servant girl saw him and began again to say to the bystanders, "This man is one of them." But again he denied it. And after a little while, the bystanders again said to Peter, "Certainly you are one of them, for you are a Galilean." So he's being recognized first by the servant girl. He retreats out to the gateway of the courtyard. She follows him and is talking among all the bystanders, the group of people who are hanging out, saying, "He's one of the guys. He's one of Jesus' followers." And they begin to say, I think you're right. I think he is one of them. He sounds like he's got the accent of a Galilean. He's got to be one of Jesus' followers. And so it's this snowball effect. Now everyone is dogpiling on Peter. And his anxiety level is skyrocketing. Verse 71. But he began to invoke a curse on himself and to swear, "I do not know this man of whom you speak." He's not using profanity here, curse. He's saying, "May I be cursed by God if what I'm saying is wrong, not right. I do not know the man of whom you speak." And immediately the rooster crowed a second time. And Peter remembered how Jesus had said to him, "Before the rooster crows twice, you will deny me 3 times. And he broke down and wept. So while Peter was denying who he was, follower of Jesus, Jesus was upstairs declaring who he was. You know, Peter had said back earlier in the chapter, we didn't read it, but earlier in the chapter, verse 31, that he would die alongside Jesus. And now he's denying even knowing Jesus. You see, because words are easy and don't cost very much when life is easy. It's easy to say you'll do something when the scenario comes. When the scenario comes, whether you do it or not doesn't depend on you saying you were going to do it. For Peter, the words were easy. "I will die with you, Jesus." But then this opportunity came to stand with Jesus, and he denied him. Words are easy. Words don't cost very much. But actions are always very expensive. Actions are always very expensive. Jesus' actions were to die and raise, and it doesn't get much more expensive than that. That's as much as it's ever going to cost. And Peter's actions were to do the very thing, denying Jesus, that he promised he would never do just a handful of hours before. Jesus declared who he was. Peter denied who he was. Words don't cost very much. You know, back in Luke chapter 6, verse 46, Jesus said, "Why do you call me Lord, Lord, and not do what I tell you?" Why do you try to associate with Jesus sometimes, but don't want to follow him enough to do what he says? He says, you want to be near me, but you don't want to follow me. You want to be near me, but not act like me. You want to say you're one of mine, but not act like it. Jesus said again in John 14:15, "If you love me, you will keep my commandments." Jesus declared who he was to bring us salvation. Peter denied who he was to try and save himself. He had said all along, "I love you, Jesus. I follow you to the ends of the earth. I will die for you, Jesus." But he didn't. In the moment when the opportunity arose, he didn't keep the commandments. He didn't follow Jesus, and he walked away. You see, declaration, as Jesus did, he declared who he was to bring us salvation. Declaration is an act of faith. To be a disciple, we have to act like it. We can't just say it. We got to act like it. In James chapter 2, James, the brother of Jesus, he said, "Some of you will say, 'You have faith and I have works.' He says, 'Show me your faith apart from your works, and I will show you my faith by my works.' Because faith apart from works is dead." Faith dies without action. It dies without action. Just crumbles and dies. Faith thrives through action. Action is the fuel that drives action, or that drives faith to function as God intends it to function. Faith was never supposed to be inactive. It was never supposed to be passive. It was always supposed to be active. It was always supposed to be something that demonstrated who we are following in Jesus. Jesus declaring who he was, Peter denying who he was, Jesus acting like who he was, Peter not so much. Is your faith active in your life? Is your faith active? Does it not just characterize who you say you are? Do your actions every day declare who you are in Christ? That doesn't mean you're never going to stumble, slip up, and mess up. We're human. We are. We're going to mess up. But the thing that puts a follower of Jesus at odds with the rest of the world is we're going to get back up and keep trying to follow Jesus. I mean, what made David a man after God's own heart? Was it all the Psalms he wrote? Was it killing Goliath? Was it not allowing Saul to be executed when he had opportunity? No, it was when David fell, he repented and turned back to God. And his faith continued through his actions. Is your faith active? Do you display every day that you belong to Jesus? I would say, a lot of times I'm like Peter. I don't act like it. Don't act like it. Because it's easier to say it than to do it. What did we saw last week? Jesus in the garden telling the disciples, the spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. And we succumb to the temptations of our mind and heart and exhaustion sometimes. But we need to strive to act as though we are disciples of Jesus. With our kids, with our parents, with our neighbors, with what we watch, what we choose to watch. Are we acting like a follower of Jesus? Do we declare that we are Christ's every day, at every moment, every opportunity we have? Like Jesus before the Sanhedrin. saying out loud and backing it up through his actions, saying who he was without any sort of denial. Maybe today you need to declare who you are in him for the first time. Say, yes, I want to know Jesus. Then do it today. Believe in Jesus today. Don't let it pass. Don't do the maybe next time, maybe if I get my life right, maybe if I do this, that, and the other thing, and I got to stop doing this, and then I'll come to Jesus. No, none of that. You can't get your life right without Jesus. That's a lie. The enemy's whispering in your ear. You got to get right before you come to Jesus. You can't. You got to come to Jesus, and then he'll work on you. Come to Jesus first. Don't worry about getting what you think is right. Come to Jesus no matter how you are, where you are, what you are. Come to Jesus and follow him. Believe in him. He's the Son of God. He died so all your sins would be forgiven. And he rose from the dead so you can live after you die. Come to Jesus. That's how the whole Bible ends. In Revelation 22, you can flip to the last page. It ends with an invitation. Come. Everyone who is thirsty, come. Come to Jesus today.